Welcome to another Anatomy and Physiology 2 Bio 265 video in a nutshell. We're going to be talking about the cardiac cycle graph. And while the graph might look confusing like a bunch of lines that don't really make a lot of sense, you're going to be surprised at how easy it is actually to understand. The entire graph is built around just 4 points. So I'm serious that it's that easy, so let's take a look at what's happening just inside the heart, because then all those confusing lines are going to start making sense. Heart's made out of muscle, it contracts and relaxes. At the top of the heart we have the two atria, and they squeeze and they push the blood through the one-way doors into the bottom parts of the heart, and those are called the ventricles. And the ventricles can then squeeze and push the blood out to the lungs or to the body respectively. Now in real life all valves, arteries, everything else is on the top of the heart, but this video is about heart function, not anatomy. So anyway, this process is going on both sides of the heart at the same time, but this video is just going to focus on the left side of the heart. We're going to take a look at the valves. Those valves are controlled by pressure. So higher pressure in the atria is going to be able to push open the mitral or bicuspid valve, and then blood can flow through into the ventricle. On the flip side, if we have more pressure in the ventricle, then it's going to be able to push the door shut. Again, it's a one-way door. So these same principles are going to be true for all of the doors. Aortic valve is the same. If I want to be able to take the aortic valve and make it shut, where do I need higher pressure? Inside the ventricle or inside the aorta? And if I want to open it, where do I need the higher pressure? Ventricle or aorta? So the answer is simple. If I want to open it, I need higher pressure in the ventricle, and if I want to close it, then I'm going to need higher pressure in the aorta, and it will shut it. So this pressure is caused by heart muscle contracting. It's squeezing the chamber space into smaller. If you think about Boyle's law, we learn that pressure and volume are inversely related. In simple terms, when I squish the blood in the ventricle into a tiny space, it's crammed in, it's going to build a high pressure, and it's going to want to get out. Let's throw out some general numbers that might give you an idea of how this works. Let's say the atria is 5, and let's say the ventricle pressure is 80. Aortic pressure is 80. If the ventricular pressure was 10, which valves in this situation are going to be open or shut? Let's focus on the mitral. Mitral, open or shut? Well, it's going to be shut because 10 is greater than 5. It's going to be able to push it shut and hold it shut. What about aortic? Well, it's going to be shut too. 10 is not greater than 80. We don't have enough pressure to push that aortic valve open. Remember that the atria squeeze first and then the ventricle's on the bottom. Let's take a look at all this info and put it onto the graph. The entire graph, it's important to remember, focuses on what's happening inside of the ventricles. Systole, diastole, these refer to what's happening inside the ventricles. Systole means to contract, and diastole means to relax. Systole means that between those solid black lines right there, the ventricle is squeezing, and diastole, between those solid black lines right there, the ventricle is relaxing. Think for a minute. During systole, what would I expect the pressure inside the ventricle to do? Squeezing it down. It's going to increase. And sure enough, take a look. That's exactly what I see. And that pressure, which valve is it going to affect as this pressure rises? Well, it's going to affect mitral. As soon as that 6 is higher than 5, the mitral valve is going to be forced shut. Let's take a look at the graph. Notice that we have our black line representing the beginning of systole, and we have a sudden peak in our blue ventricular line that happens right afterwards. Makes sense, we talked about that. Notice that the blue ventricular line is going to pass the black atrial line at the exact moment where systole begins, right on that solid black line, as soon as it squeezes. 5's super easy to beat, so that door is going to shut almost instantly. Now this is point number 1, the closing the mitral valve. Ventricular just past atrial. Now think about valves where we have the mitral valve just shut, we're greater than 5, but 6 is less than 80. in order to open up the aortic valve. In the meantime, which valves are open? Well, it's a trick question. None of the valves are open. They can't be. We're going up from 5 to 80, but as long as we're in that middle range, the blood has nowhere to go. We're still stuck. This phase is called isovolumic, or same volume. Between 5 and 80, the blood has nowhere to go. Both valves are shut. This isovolumic phase is between the solid black line and between the first dotted line. We're waiting for the ventricular pressure to increase high enough to pass the black aortic line. Notice that the ventricular volume during this isovolumic phase is a flat line. It can't change. It has nowhere to go. Now, once the pressure inside the ventricle passes 80, what's going to happen valve-wise? Well, you know. It's going to be able to push open the aortic valve. And let's take a look, because on the graph, we're able to see the ventricular pressure as it's rising, and we have the black aortic line chilling right around 80, and the point where they cross right at the dotted end of isovolumic contraction line. Makes sense? Ejection is going to begin right there. This is point number 2 right there, and it's the opening of the aortic valve. We passed 80. What would you expect the ventricular volume to do as soon as the aortic valve is able to be pushed open? Blood's leaving. Well, it's pretty straightforward. You got it. It's going to be decreasing. And sure enough, when we take a look at the graph, that's exactly what we see right here. Let's take a look, because as long as we're in systole, we have these two pressures at the top that are kind of fighting back and forth, but the valve's still open. However, as soon as we reach the end of systole, as soon as the black line right here showing the end of systole, we notice that the black aortic line is higher than the blue ventricular line. It's because the ventricle is no longer squeezing. This is point number 3, and that's where the aortic valve is going to shut. We are now less than 80. Aortic is higher. Notice that our blood is going to keep that aortic valve shut, but right now, again, valves are both shut, because as long as we're between 5 and 80, we're isovolumic again. So notice again we have this isovolumic phase as our ventricular pressure drops. We're waiting to get below 5, that atrial black line at the bottom. In the meantime, we have a flat line, as noted right there. Blood has nowhere to go. We're less than 80, but not yet less than 5. In order to reopen the mitral valve, what needs to happen? Ventricular needs to be less than? Well, you know the answer. You got this. It's got to be less than 5. As soon as we're less than 5, the mitral valve is going to reopen and blood can flow into the ventricle. We're just waiting for the ventricle to relax that much. This point right here is point number 4. Right at the end of isovolumic relaxation, it's where the mitral valve is going to reopen as the blue ventricular drops below the black atrial line. And then we see this rise in ventricular volume as blood rushes into the ventricles, and we have our rapid inflow. So let's do a quick review. And I want you to think about in your mind, as I go through each of these, which of these 4 points represent valves opening and which valves closing, and think about why those valves are opening or shutting, why the pressure's higher or lower, whether the ventricles are squeezing or relaxing. So point number 1, we have our mitral valve closing. Why is it closing? Point number 2, our aortic valve's opening. Why? Point 3, aortic valve shuts again. Why is it shutting? And point number 4, mitral valve's going to reopen. Why is it opening again? So let's jump back over to our diastole phase. Notice that we have this rapid inflow that we talked about as the blood rushes into the ventricle. And then right after that, we have kind of a flat, leveling out. Diastasis is what it's called. Diastasis, diastole have the same root, and they both mean to relax. And so it's kind of really a rest within a rest. Not much is happening here. And then after that, we have atrial systole. The atria are going to squeeze. They're going to push the last little bit of blood down into the ventricles. And it's really kind of a topping off phase. And sure enough, we see that little increase in our volume line. And then, of course, it's all going to happen again. We're going to have another phase of systole. You can see our black systole line is going to occur. And then we've got our whole ventricular blue line is going to go back up, and the whole process is going to happen again. It's a cycle. Let's take a minute and talk about the heart sounds and the EKG. And we're going to focus first on the heart sounds because they're super easy. When you realize that heart sounds are caused by valves closing. So think for a minute. Which of these 4 points represent valves shutting? You know, it's going to be 1 and 3. Well, guess what? Sure enough, we see heart sounds happening after 1 and after 3. Sure enough. And the EKG is actually super easy when you realize that, I mean, there's a whole ton in your textbook where it goes about dipoles and movements and up and down. And this is in a nutshell. This is meant to be super simple. So just think about the EKG like electrical instructions. Make it easy. These things are what's telling the heart to do. The P wave tells the atria to contract, QRS tells the ventricle to contract, and the T tells the ventricle to relax. Make it that easy. Now, notice that there isn't a phase or a thing for atrial relaxation. That's because that signal comes during the QRS complex. It happens, but we can't see it. The QRS complex is so big that it completely buries the signal saying atria, relax. Anyway, you can think about these kind of like a starting gun to race, where the gun is going to go off, and then a fraction of a second later, the runners are actually going to hear it, and then they're going to leave their marks. But the gun comes first, and in that same way, the electrical signal is going to come first, and then the heart muscle is going to respond just a fraction of a second later. So take a look at the cardiac cycle graph. Sure enough, here's our QRS complex telling the ventricle to squeeze, and it happens right before the solid black line of systole, because that's what it's causing. And then we have the T wave, happens right before the solid black line of diastole, which it's causing. And then, sure enough, our P wave happens right before the dotted line of atrial systole, which is what it's causing. Super straightforward. There you have it, the whole cardiac cycle, 4 points. If you can just remember which valves are opening, closing, pressures, heart movement, and think about the electrical signals causing those valves to open or shut, or the pressures that are causing them to open or shut, and connect it with the heart squeezing and relaxing, you can redo this any day from memory. Draw it on your own. You've got this. Good luck with your studies. Thank you.